it's reasonable, is kind of what I would say. There's nothing too off, which is a nice place to start. When we're talking about a bike position, we're going to focus on the pedalling movement initially, because everything at the back of the bike here is going to be centered around your bottom bracket. So that needs to work effectively to begin with. And once we're happy the pedalling is doing what we'd like it to, we can then get the front to match the back afterwards.
Yes.
So we'll talk about the front briefly, but then we'll kind of ignore it for a little while, basically. So the position at the front of the bike, we need to grab some measurements to see how much space we've got to adjust things within UCR rules, because we haven't measured that yet. But in the moment it looks a little bit squashed on the bike, which matches you saying like occasionally you're hitting the knees and the elbows and stuff. So this, ideally we'd like to come further forwards to make it easier to flatten out through this flexion we've got in that mid-thoracic, that this is kind of sticking up in the air too much. And as well, if we can flatten through that, it'll make it easier to keep this head position down. Because at the moment, where we're getting this flexion here, you're then having to extend the cervical to see where you're going.
Yeah, I felt that when I've tried at home.
Yeah.
I have a hard time getting my...
Yeah, actually looking in a forward direction.
Yeah.
And that comes from this part more than the neck, really. Because if this is pointing down, you've got a much bigger angle change to actually see where you're going. It's essentially like looking up in the air. Whereas if we can kind of flatten through that mid-back, your head will look forwards a lot more effectively. At the same time as lowering everything, which is good, because if this comes further down, then that's also going to be able to come further down.
Yes.
Some of that's going to be technique as well. Some of it's not the most natural thing in the world. Some of it's going to be a manual activation of extension of that thoracic, but we can play around with that as we go. Like I said, we'll kind of ignore a lot of that for a while and come back around to it after we play with the saddle. So the seating position almost looks a little bit on the high side. We've got some data we'll take some measurements from in a minute. But it looks a little bit high maybe. We're going to go through some flexibility tests and things as well in a second. We'll be able to see what you actually can do mobility wise, because the more flexible you are, the different saddle position we can get to basically, so that we can get to a greater level of extension through the knees if we're flexible enough to do that. But yeah, initial knee extension is not crazy on the left hand side. We're kind of... So this is what we were speaking about earlier on. So the blue line is the peak extension. It's a really awkward colour. I can make that maybe an easier colour to see. Let's go. Yeah, there we go, that's a bit easier. So you see kind of like this is over what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, about 12 pedal strokes.
Yes.
And the highest extension is about just short of 146, like 145.9 degrees.
Yeah.
And the lowest is about 143. So you've got almost 3 degrees of variability within 12 pedal strokes. So, like I say, picking an absolute number that you're aiming for isn't real, because that's not... People aren't that consistent, basically. People aren't robotic enough.
Yeah, we're not machines.
Pretty much. That's, yeah, we made my job easier. Okay, so we'll do all the tests on the right leg first, and then afterwards we'll spin you around and see what the left leg can do too.
Yes.
We're going to do a knee extension test to begin with. So this one, we're going to lift your right leg up. We're going to bend your knee to start with, so you can come to here, that's good. And then we'll point your toe towards your shin, so you're pointing this back as far as you can and getting this muscle here to engage.
Yes.
And then we're going to try and get you to straighten your knee, so this part of the leg comes up in the air. So we're going to lift this bit up, so straighten your leg. Any more? Hopefully more. I'm guessing that's about it. Yep. And you can relax, thank you. Cool, all the way down.
This thing with pointing the toes
makes it a lot worse. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's just slightly below average, actually, for that. Yeah. So, saddle's too high, is the short of it.
Yes.
Because for context, so this is about 138 degrees, and it's a little bit exaggerated because we closed the hip and the ankle. But on the bike, your maximum extension on the left side is about 146 degrees. So on the bike, you're extending about 8 degrees further than you were just doing here, for context. And it's easier to do because, like you say, when we're not dorsiflexing the ankle, when we're not closing the hip up, we're putting some preload on a lot of those muscles by doing those. But it's not particularly flexible, is the short. In a perfect world, that should be able to straighten the leg at hip of 90 degrees. That should be super attainable. That shouldn't be a particularly big challenge. Unfortunately, riding bikes makes this worse. So there needs to be some external intervention to improve that, basically. Okay. But this links to basically everything else we've already spoken about with the other tests. So it's not super surprising. It's slightly worse than I was hoping for, but it's around where we were thinking, really. We're going to check hip flexion on this one too. So this time, try and keep the leg relaxed. Okay. I'm going to move the leg for you, if that's okay.
Yes.
Perfect. So nice and relaxed. Just drop that down. Relax. Easier said than done, I appreciate it.
Yes.
When you say relax, you can just watch everyone tense up. Yeah, you just see the quads getting defined. It's a little better. Let's see what we get. Reasonable.
I can sit in this position on my feet.
Yeah. With everything in line or not?
I don't know. I just know I can sit.
Because what we end up with, once we start to go into this greater flexion, we're starting to see the shank angle again, basically. So we're getting an external rotation of the hip from that.
Yes.
Which is what we see on the bike as well. So when you see, if you think back to the bike, as you go through the top of the pedal stroke, you're seeing this starting to happen. On the bike, this can't point in, which is what it's doing here. So on the bike, this gets held still, which then causes that to push out instead, basically. The flexion you get to is reasonable before we get to that point. But the internal rotation is really quite limited, which probably links to some of the weakness stuff we saw in the lower back earlier as well. You can relax, you got it, thank you. But yeah, the end range of flexion is quite okay, because once we get past that point here, we're then starting to roll the whole pelvis backwards, so we're not flexing the hip anymore. And that we'll probably see earlier on the left side than the right, I would guess, because the left one's the one we saw elevating rather than flexing on the bike. Where you get to there is about 121, 122, average is 100 to 120, so it's slightly above average with that, but the levels of internal rotation were really quite limited. And again, we'll try and straighten your knee in the eye now. I'd say by the look of that, you're about done. And relax, thank you. You got it? Much the same is the good news. So relative levels of symmetry we can say is a positive from this. It's about almost 140. So they're about the same as each other, but they both need to be better, is the short of it.
Okay.
We'll check the hip on this side too, though, because this is where we'll maybe see some slight differences, but let's find out. So again, just try and relax.
Yeah, it was the relaxed part.
Exactly, that's the tricky part of this test, switching it off. Almost no internal rotation with that. I guess that feels relatively tight when that's trying to. Yeah.
Feels here as well.
Yeah. Whereas external rotation is perfectly fine. We've got loads. That I think is again going to link back, like I said, to some of the stuff we'd spoken about with the hips and the back earlier on, basically. So it's nothing new or surprising. It's just the same thing in a different view. Exactly. Okay, and relax for me, thank you. You got it. And again, end range is about the same in terms of flexion itself, it's just that internal rotation. So if you can do 2 minutes for me, then we'll let you stop. That's all we need. And the other way the test ends is if I think we become too unstable. So if, for example, if the lower back starts to drop too much, the hips start to dip, knees are bending, I'll give you some warning, and if you can't control those things, that's become willpower rather than core strength, basically. Which is great, but it's not what we're testing for, unfortunately. Okay, but when you're ready, let's see what happens. Great, and we're off.
Is it okay?
That looks good, yeah. We still have a little bit of that flexion through the top of the back, which we'd seen everywhere else, so we're aware of that at this point, but nothing to worry about.
Otherwise, shaking.
Posture looks good.
Keep it tight.
It's a nice one to finish with, isn't it?
Hold on.
Just keep this a little bit higher for me. That's good. We're at 40 seconds now. That's a good start.
Ser bra ut.
Still feeling okay?
It's
Relative term?
I'm
Why not?
struggling.
Mannen, det håller det här.
Good so far. Keep it going.
Mannen.
Seconds left. Keep it up. Keep pushing. Keep the hips a little bit higher for me. Push those hips up.
Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah.
I'm done.
Come on.
30 seconds to go. You can do this.
You can do it. Hold on.
Almost there now. 20 seconds. Keep breathing.
Breathe.
Keep it going. Last
Good.
15 seconds. You're almost there now. You've basically finished this. Don't stop now. 10 seconds left to go. Keep breathing.
Du klarar det.
That's good. Keep
Det är lugnt det här.
5 seconds left. Keep going. Go, 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 go. Don't stop yet. 3, 2,
Har du fusktränat eller?
and stop. So go.
Oh, yes.
You did it.
Was that 2
That's
minutes?
2 minutes. Yeah.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Was that your power balance?
Yeah,
Yeah. 48,
Yeah.
52.
yeah, 52 on the right.
Which would make sense because you're
Around there.
putting more weight on the right side. Yeah.
So,
How does that feel this time out of the rest?
huh?
How does the position feel on that?
It feels low.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not used to it, so. It feels also like, we call it quads, right?
Yeah.
Like the quads are working more.
Yeah, which they will do with the saddle being a bit lower probably. Which, yeah, remarkable
That's the
on that.
initial, my initial impressions.
Yeah, and it's normal that it would feel just awkward to begin with.
Yeah.
And the right side does look like we're underextended because you're still sitting off to the right hand side basically. And if you sit off the right hand side and the right leg was underextending before, it's still underextending now basically. Let's get a recording of you from behind and check that. And keep looking straight ahead again for me. And we'll let you relax again there. That's good. So you can hop up when you're ready. Let's see what we've got. So, lowering the saddle has had basically no positive effect on the hip placement. So, there's no real reason to have come down in that case, basically. So we can probably come back up again.
Okay.
It didn't do anything particularly negative, but it's not done anything helpful either. So in terms of side view, this is where you were before and where you are now. And basically we've just bent your knee a little bit more, which will mean that we've also done the same on the right hand side because your hip's still in the same place on the saddle, and the right knee was already underextended. So what we were hoping to see was that you would get a bit more central with the lower saddle position. Didn't happen at all, so we'll come back up with that basically. We'll get a quick recording on the saddle pressure as well, just so you can see whether you are sitting off that right hand side, because we'll see where you are sitting on the saddle more so. See which side's getting more low, because it's maybe as well if the saddle's a little bit too wide at the front, for example, that can sometimes cause these rotations to happen because you can't get the hip around both sides so well.
Okay.
It's more likely just your left hip that's not strong enough basically, which is going to still be there at the end of today. Unfortunately, your hip's not going to get stronger in the next hour and a half or so. It would be nice if that's how it worked, but yeah, kind of what we were expecting in some way. So your right hip's almost off the side of the saddle basically is what that would suggest.
Yes.
So we've got actually more load on the left than the right. 56% of the loading is on the left side of the saddle, and the right hip's kind of fallen off the side a little bit. So that probably explains why we're seeing that left hip kind of jump up as it comes to the top of the power stroke. It's potentially as much as anything the right side actually falling down more. But we'll try some different shape saddles in that area and see if we can get more of the hip on the saddle, basically. And at the same time, we'll come back up again because lowering it, like I say, had no.
What are those?
So that's the pressure in millibars, basically.
Oh, okay.
So that's the peak pressure in each of the thirds on the saddle.
Ah.
So the saddle gets basically split into left and right, rear and front, basically. So that's the highest point in the front third, highest point in the left, highest point in the right. So the peak pressure is actually more on the right hand side, but there's more total pressure on the left hand side, because the right side you're on a more isolated point basically. And then at the same time, total weight on the saddle is quite limited. How much do you weigh at the moment?
63.
63, and you've only got about 10 kilos on the saddle, so we'd expect a little bit more than that. Not loads more, to be fair. You'd be... I'd be looking about 150 newtons or so on the saddle, or about 106, so it's in the ballpark. But it's a bit lower in terms of the average force on the saddle, which suggests that you're not putting enough weight on the saddle, which then means you can put more weight on the arms, the shoulders, the feet. You're basically just standing up too much, whereas that weight should be distributed at least to a large portion on the saddle itself.
Oh, this is pressure.
The saddle?
Yes.
In a bad way, by the sound of that noise.
I don't know yet, but I can definitely feel
Different.
pressure.
Let's see what we've got there. So keep looking where you're going for me. I'll let you all relax that one. That's good. Perfect. So, when you're ready, you can hop off the bike and we'll show you what we're trying to do with this. So, for a start, we'll show you saddle pressure. So saddle pressure has changed.
Yeah.
You're definitely sitting further back is the main positive aspect of it. So the width of the front of the saddle is, I think, an improvement. And we see that as well if we open... So this was with the old saddle, step away too way forwards. So with the new saddle, we can see that the hip comes back a lot more basically, relative to where you were before. So this is where your hip now sits. And then previously you were sitting forwards to there basically. So the hip changes quite a lot further back, even though the saddle's in the same setback. Just on this saddle you're sitting more rearward on the saddle basically, which is a good thing. So it gets your hip further back, which gives you more room to flatten into, gives you more of a lever for the hip extensors. Generally that's not a bad outcome from that. What we then wanted you to do though was to sit differently. So on the right hand side is what we're trying to get you to do.
Yes.
And then when we overlay between those two, you see the big change in terms of the posture through that, and that your head comes down and forward significantly. And that's how we'd like you to sit on the bike, but it's going to take training and practice to actually do that. Just because we would like you to doesn't mean that you'll just get on the bike and do it. But you actually managed to sustain that quite well, which is positive. And it's going to only get easier with the strength and mobility work that we'll give you for the training off the bike. That's going to make that a lot easier to attain.
Yes.
And then just dropping that head down a little bit. And I don't, yeah, there we go. That's nice.
Kan sitta sen timme? 1 hour.
Not now.
I wouldn't expect you to. If you could do an hour in that already, then I would change more, basically. It shouldn't be something that you can hold for an hour yet. There needs to be some level of aspiration in the position. So you've got what you've just done now on the right compared to what you're doing initially on the left, basically with the helmet. So when we overlay the two, you see obviously a huge difference in terms of the shape of the back on the back.
Yes.
And the head position comes down a little bit from there as well, but it's also much less extended through the neck, whereas previously you're kind of looking sort of in that general direction. This will look forwards more through here, but the muscles here are going to take some practice and encouragement to get used to doing this, because they're perfectly happy not doing anything. They're quite happy to just relax, but they shouldn't be. They should be working to support the torso. And like I say, once you then start to get better at doing this, we can hinge everything more at the hip, because in the meantime we've been working on the hip strength as well. So everything's going to be in a position that we can start to use that more, basically. And like I say, that shouldn't take too long before we get to the point that you can do that. But it's just going to take some practice on working on this. I would be tempted not to cut anything until you've made some progress and we start to strengthen things. Because if we're sitting on the trainer for the next 6 weeks or so, because I guess it's mostly going to be on the trainer still for you.
Yes.
Yeah. It doesn't really matter if it's entirely UCL legal at that point, if you see what I mean. So until we're kind of closer to being finished with the position, but then did you say you're racing in April or May?
April 15.
So we didn't go that long, do we?
No.
What's that?
Yeah, I mean, this year for me is more trial and error kind of thing.
Yes.
Everything is on you.
Just
so
to try things.
I have no goals to perform a certain
somewhere on a particular day, or but I would at least probably leave this for a few weeks to kind of adapt to on the trainer, because what we'll want to do probably when we come a bit lower with this, we'll probably come a little bit closer as well, so we'll kind of tuck everything in a bit more at that point in time. But if we still have the bar to be able to do that, it's going to make it easier. Whereas if we cut the bars for this position, the later position is going to get more difficult to do, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So at the moment, all we've done is kind of kept it high and long so that we start to stretch out the back and we get you used to doing that.